It's hard to explain what happened at Evergreen Heights, a private school in the suburbs of Massachusetts. The events of March 2024 still echo through the empty hallways, where 47 students were simultaneously hospitalized with second-degree burns in the shape of human faces on their hands. But to understand this incident, we need to go back a few months, when our school became the epicenter of a progressive educational revolution. Evergreen Heights was always known for its centuries-old tradition. Its oak corridors and Victorian stained glass told stories dating back to 1892. But in 2023, after intense student protests and social media pressure, the school board decided it was time for a radical change. Hiring Dr. Christina Walsh as principal was the first step. Walsh arrived with a mission to transform Evergreen Heights into a beacon of educational progress. Her resume was impressive: a PhD in decolonial studies, a master's in applied social justice, and a series of articles on deconstructing institutional privilege in education. In her first weeks, she had already implemented mandatory pronouns on badges, gender-neutral bathrooms, and a new code of conduct that punished microaggressions with the same severity as physical violence. The decolonization of institutional memory project was her crowning achievement. The idea was simple. Every historical image that did not adequately represent modern diversity had to be removed. We can't expect our students to thrive while being haunted by the ghosts of historical privilege, she would say in her mandatory weekly lectures on active social awareness. No one imagined that the ghosts of privilege she so often spoke of would become terrifyingly literal, or that the scars left by her progressive crusade would cut far deeper than marks on old photographs. My name is Sarah Thompson, and I was the school psychologist at Evergreen Heights when it all began. The arrival of Principal Christina Walsh in the fall of 2023 marked a radical shift in the century-old institution. With her PhD in decolonial studies from Berkeley Field and a history of progressive activism, she came determined to transform Evergreen Heights into a beacon of social awareness. The decolonization of institutional memory project was just the beginning. Walsh implemented a social credit system where students earned extra credit for reporting problematic behaviors of their peers and teachers. History classes were completely rewritten to focus exclusively on narratives of oppression. Even the cafeteria was forced to serve only vegan options after Walsh declared that meat consumption is structural violence. The review of the school's historical archive, dating back to 1892, became her personal obsession. Every non-representative image is an act of violence against our marginalized students, she declared at faculty meetings, presenting detailed spreadsheets categorizing photos by levels of historical toxicity. The faculty was divided. Some, like history teacher James Morrison, tried to argue for the importance of preserving historical records, even the imperfect ones. He was promptly labeled a defender of white patriarchy and placed on administrative leave for sensitivity retraining. The Student Committee for Historical Justice was formed, led by students carefully selected by Walsh. They were granted authority to sift through archives, identify and mark for destruction any image deemed triggering or non-representative. For every photo burned, Walsh held an energetic cleansing ceremony with crystals and incense, declaring they were cleansing the institution's colonial karma. The few parents who questioned the initiative were accused of perpetuating generational trauma and invited to attend mandatory workshops on anti-oppressive parenting. The school board, fearing being labeled regressive, unanimously approved all the measures. By October, the historical cleansing process was in full swing. Entire graduation albums were incinerated for lacking adequate diversity. Photos of historic school events were destroyed for showing predominance of privilege. Even pictures from the 1990s were deemed problematic for not including neutral pronouns in their captions. Walsh maintained a digital scoreboard in the main lobby tracking the number of decolonized images, her term for destroyed photos. She even started a weekly podcast called Dismantling Visual Patriarchy, where she celebrated the progress of the initiative and called on other schools to follow suit. It was in this climate of constant surveillance and ideological purity that the first nightmares began. No one could have imagined that the burned images would find their own form of resistance, or that Walsh's obsession with erasing the past would awaken forces she couldn't control. In the first weeks, the historical cleansing project turned into an ideological competition. Students formed the Digital Decolonization Committee, led by Amy Liu. The group combed through archives, not just for non-inclusive photos, but also captions, documents, and even donation records that might have ties to a problematic past. Amy was the perfect leader, president of the debate club, anti-racist activist, always ready to point out microaggressions in any situation. She turned the search for old photos into a moral crusade. Every image found was subjected to an impromptu tribunal, where students debated whether the photo was offensive enough to be destroyed. It was Amy who found that first photo from 1923. It was an image of the debate team, ironic, given her current position. 20 white youths in dark suits, confident smiles, holding a trophy. This is the personification of institutionalized white privilege, she declared during a committee meeting. The group decided to make the destruction of that photo an event. They organized a ceremony they called the Ritual of Historical Purification. Students gave speeches about colonialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Someone brought a sage stick to cleanse the negative energies. The photo was burned to the sound of chants about social justice. That night, Amy woke up screaming. The marks on her hands were inexplicable, each face in the photo perfectly imprinted on her skin, as if she had held a branding iron, but she refused to see it as a warning. It's just my generational trauma manifesting physically, she insisted. The committee intensified its activities. Jackson Williams, who discovered an entire album of 1950s graduations, organized a progressive bonfire party. Maria Rodriguez found photos of old school parties with costumes, now considered cultural appropriation. All were thrown into the flames. With every photo destroyed, more students woke up with burns. But the group interpreted this as validation. Our bodies are processing centuries of oppression, they theorized. Physical pain is part of collective healing. Principal Walsh encouraged them. She brought in speakers on historical trauma and body decolonization. An ancestral healing specialist suggested that the burns were manifestations of cellular memories of oppression being released. Committee meetings became cathartic sessions where students competed to find the most problematic photos. Images with overly binary gender uniforms, burned. Homogeneous groups, destroyed. An old science fair showing only Western projects, to the flames. When the faces began appearing during the day, the committee organized collective visual deprogramming sessions. They argued the visions were just internalized social constructs that needed to be deconstructed. The more they tried to rationalize, the more intense the apparitions became. The point of no return came when they discovered the 1943 archive. Hundreds of photos showing school events during the war. Amy declared that keeping any records from that era was complicity with militaristic power structures. They burned everything in a single night. The next morning, 12 students woke up with identical burns, and yet they persisted. Each burn mark was seen as a badge of honor in the fight against the oppressive past. Each disturbing vision was reinterpreted as growth. To the very end, they refused to see they were repeating the same kind of erasure they claimed to oppose. In December, The situation exploded like an ideological powder keg. Principal Walsh convened a task force for emotional safety preservation, led by Dr. Marcus Reed, a specialist in decolonizing educational spaces from Berkeley. Students who resisted the process of destroying the photos were labeled as perpetuators of generational trauma. Sarah Martinez, a history club senior, was suspended for arguing that some photos had historical value. The official justification? Promotion of psychological violence through the defense of oppressive symbols. The apparitions intensified. In the newly installed gender-neutral bathrooms, figures from the photos appeared in the mirrors, their melted faces pleading not to be forgotten. The entire girls' basketball team had to forfeit a game after every player saw their reflections on the court replaced by images of the 1945 boys' team. Walsh doubled down. She hired an anti-fascist energy healer to conduct a decolonial aura cleansing on campus. During the ritual, 3 students fainted, burns on their wrists forming faces of former school nurses who had served during World War II. The history department was completely restructured. Textbooks were replaced with deconstructed narratives. A teacher was fired for suggesting that the records of the school's first Black and immigrant students should at least be preserved. Ironically, those photos were also thrown into the fire in the name of neutrality of the process. The collective nightmares worsened. Students reported dreams where they were judged by a tribunal of melted faces, accused of existential erasure. Each new photo burning was followed by a wave of mysterious burn marks. The school infirmary began documenting bizarre cases, students waking up speaking dead languages, reciting names of classes that graduated decades ago, and describing in detail school events from the 1920s. A first-year girl spent 3 days, convinced she was Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a Latin teacher from 1918. Walsh responded with more experts, consultants on historical privilege to programming, therapists specializing in colonial trauma, even a digital shaman to purify the school's Wi-Fi from regressive energies. Each new initiative seemed to feed the phenomenon further. The walls began oozing a dark liquid that, when analyzed, was revealed to be old printer ink. The climax came when the Psychological Safety Committee decided that even mentioning the apparitions constituted perpetuation of problematic narratives. Students were forbidden from discussing their nightmares under penalty of intensive re-education. But how do you silence terror when it's etched into your very flesh? In March, Principal Walsh organized a mandatory assembly on collective historical healing. The auditorium was decorated with posters about dismantling historical privilege and embracing the intersectional future. A PowerPoint presentation showed statistics on how the removal of problematic images had improved student well-being. Today marks 6 months of our memory decolonization program, Walsh declared proudly. Thanks to our progressive work, we have eliminated 2,847 toxic images from our institutional history. The audience applauded mechanically. I noticed several students wearing gloves, trying to hide their burn marks. In the front row, Amy Lou was visibly trembling. Walsh continued, and to celebrate our commitment to social justice, we've created a new school logo that truly represents our diversity. That's when the lights failed. The PowerPoint screen flickered and began showing the photos we had burned. Hundreds of them in a disturbing sequence. But now the people in the images were moving. This wasn't part of the program, Walsh stammered as she tried to shut off the projector. The images kept changing. Boys from 1923 playing baseball, their faces melting as they smiled. The graduating class of 1945, including 3 war veterans, their faces dripping like wax. The choir of 1967, their distorted mouths trying to sing. Then all the photos began to merge. The melted faces formed new faces. which also melted. It was an endless cycle of transformation and destruction. "Look," Maria Rodriguez shouted. "They're trying to tell us something." Indeed, the melted mouths now formed clear words. "Erasing is not inclusion." That's when 47 students, as if hypnotized, rose simultaneously and walked toward the screen. Walsh screamed about resistance to progress and privilege trauma, but no one listened. The students touched the screen all at once. The smell of burning flesh filled the auditorium. Their screams mixed with the whispers from the images. "We exist, we resist, we persist." In the chaos that followed, I heard Walsh mutter something about necessary consequences of social justice as she called for ambulances. But her eyes betrayed a deeper fear, the fear of someone realizing they may have gone too far in their crusade for historical correction. The images on the screen kept moving even after the building's power was completely shut off. And I swear, for a moment, all those melted faces smiled in unison, not a smile of victory, but a sad understanding that history, once erased, finds its own ways to be remembered. The official investigation turned into a media circus. CNN sent a special team to cover what they called the traumatic awakening of Evergreen Heights. Activists on social media fought over narratives. Some called the burns physical manifestations of colonial trauma, while others argued it was a somatic response to historical privilege. The Department of Education sent a special commission of social memory curators, led by Dr. Rachel Montgomery, a specialist in institutional decolonization. Her 200-page report concluded that the events were a collective expression of unprocessed historical guilt and recommended an even more intense program of historical re-education. The school implemented new measures, mandatory sessions on ancestral privilege processing, where students had to acknowledge and atone for their ancestors' historical sins. They installed racial confrontation mirrors in hallways, where students were encouraged to deconstruct their own social image. The curriculum was entirely rewritten to include only approved narratives of restorative justice. The burns on students were reinterpreted as marks of social awakening. Some parents even began pressuring their children to participate in the next historical purification event, hoping they too would be marked by awareness. Principal Walsh's case was particularly disturbing. While she remained in a coma, her body became an ideological battleground. Activists held vigils outside the hospital, chanting mantras about ancestral healing and colonial liberation. Some claimed her state was a conscious transcendence, that she had become a channel for marginalized historical voices. The burned faces on her hands were photographed, analyzed, and turned into NFTs by a collective of social justice artists. Each face was associated with a specific cause and auctioned to fund more historical awareness programs. Progressive media celebrated Evergreen Heights as a landmark in institutional awakening. The school received awards for innovation and restorative justice and excellence in historical deconstruction. Enrollment tripled as progressive parents scrambled to enroll their children in the School of Physical Awakening. But at night, when the spotlights dimmed and the cameras left, the truth whispered through the empty halls. The original students, those with the burns, began meeting secretly in the abandoned library. They spoke about the nightmares that persisted, no longer about the faces from old photos, but of a future where every memory would be judged, filtered, and possibly erased. On my last night as the school psychologist, I found a group of these students. They had discovered something disturbing. The marks on their hands were changing. The old faces were being replaced by their own faces, slowly melting. "It's as if the past is warning us," said Maria Rodriguez, her bandaged hands trembling. "Today, we're erasing them. Tomorrow, someone will decide that our memories are too problematic to exist." Evergreen Heights continues to be celebrated as a model of institutional progress. But if you visit the school today, you'll notice something strange. There are no more mirrors in the bathrooms. The windows have been frosted and cell phone screens are prohibited. Because sometimes, in reflective surfaces, the faces still appear. Not just the old ones, but faces from the present and the future, all melting together in a silent scream against forced forgetting. The school's new motto, painted in giant letters in the lobby, reads, "The past is privilege, the future is justice." But at night, they say the letters seem to bleed, forming a different message. Who will control your memories tomorrow?